Hello everyone and welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss the present lecture is a part of a paper, Media and Globalization. The lecture deals with the conceptual understanding of regulation and self-regulation. We will discuss the agencies and control mechanisms which ensure the functioning of such a process in India. In the lecture, we will understand the meaning of regulation and self-regulation and how regulation has moved to self-regulation in the Indian media scenario. We will also understand the different agencies and laws which deal with regulation and self-regulation. Let us first see what is the rationale for media regulation. The rationale for media regulation in general stems from considerations of economic efficiency and public interest, while the rationale for media-specific regulations arise from keeping the citizens in the central position. The economic efficiency rationale is generic in nature, vis-a-vis the rationale for public interest, as the former applies across markets that operate under non-competitive conditions, while the latter applies mainly to the market for media products. For example, regulations in the form of requirement that network operators must carry public service programs to ensure their universal access and discoverability, policies directed at ensuring production of wide-ranging, high-quality programs, and programming that reflects regional and national viewpoints. Meaning and types of regulation. There are various meanings and types of regulations, with the former ranging from the narrowest to the broadest. Beginning with the simplest and the narrowest definition, regulation refers to the promulgation of an authoritative set of rules, accompanied by some mechanism, typically a public agency, for monitoring and promoting compliance with these rules. This meaning is broader since it also incorporates matters relating to redistribution, public ownership, taxation, and subsidies. Lastly, in its broadest form, regulation includes all mechanisms of social control, including unintentional and non-state processes. It extends to mechanisms which are not the products of state activity, nor part of any institutional arrangement, such as the development of social norms and the effects of markets in modifying behavior. This implies that the notion of intentionality about the development of norms is dropped, and anything producing effects on behavior is capable of being considered as regulatory. Moreover, it tends to include various activities which may involve legal or quasi-legal norms, but without mechanisms for monitoring and enforcement. Secondly, it refers to all the efforts of state agencies to steer the economy. There are, in general, 4 types of regulation. First is complete regulation. Media is accorded no freedom, and the government actively vets its contents and can ask for amendments in media reports. This is the practice in Turkey, UAE, and China. Second is co-regulation. In this case, a non-state regulatory system links up with state regulation, similar to what Australia had much earlier. Third is statutory regulation. The state, by way of statutes, administers and enforces specified regulations. The Press Council Act in India being an example of this type of regulation. And lastly, self-regulation. regulations which are administered and enforced by the entities themselves through internal policies. The Press Council of India, for instance, has a limited role, and therefore India is often listed under the self-regulation category. Complete regulation and co-regulation categories allow for governments to frame regulations pertaining to reporting by media so as to serve their own convenience. In addition, the concerned officials are under no obligation to provide any explanation or interpretation as to why certain news is regulated. This creates a situation wherein the journalists may have no idea what is permissible and what is not permissible. Self-regulation implies that the working body comes up with its own rules and regulations and involves self-monitoring of the work which one does. The press councils in the mainstream European Union member countries can be cited as an example of this type of regulation. This can be achieved through various ways such as cooperative regulation, delegated regulation, devolved regulation, and facilitated regulation. Media regulation in India. Mass media laws in India have a long history and are deeply rooted in the country's colonial experience under the British rule. The earliest regulatory measures can be traced back to 1799 when Lord Wellesley promulgated the press regulations. Initially, it was considered that the press should not be given complete freedom since it could generate mischief afterwards. Hence, a need for a correctional mechanism was felt. The idea of regulation arose from that logic. The date 26th of January 1950, besides being of great importance in the history of India, as on that day the constitution of the country came into force, is also a significant date in the history of media regulations. Being under the British Raj for a little less than 9 decades, the Indians understood very well the critical importance of the freedom of press. This was therefore sought to be ensured through an indirect manner by way of the Article 19(1)(a) in the Constitution, which guaranteed freedom of speech and expression. Here, it is relevant to point out that this freedom is not absolute, and under certain conditions that are explicitly mentioned, curbs can be imposed on the freedom of speech and expression. This was followed by the Press Objectionable Matters Act of 1951, the Newspaper Prices and Pages Act of 1956, and the Press Council Act of 1978. The broadcast media was also under complete monopoly of the Government of India. Private organizations were involved only in commercial advertising and sponsorships of programs. However, in Secretary Ministry of Information and Broadcasting versus Cricket Association of Bengal, the Supreme Court clearly differed from the monopolistic approach of the government and emphasized that citizens had the right to telecast and broadcast any important event through electronic media, television or radio. It also ruled that the government had no monopoly over electronic media, since there was no mention of such monopolistic power of the government anywhere in the Constitution or in any other law prevailing in the country. The Supreme Court judgment in a 1995 case read, "There is no doubt that since the airwaves or frequencies are a public property and are also limited, they have to be used in the best interest of the society. And this can be done either by a central authority by establishing its own broadcasting network or regulating the grant of licenses to other agencies, including the private agencies. The right to use the airwaves and the content of the programs, therefore, needs regulation for balancing it and as well as to prevent monopoly of informations and views relayed, which is a potential danger flowing from the concentration of the right to broadcast or telecast in the hands either of a central agency or a few private affluent broadcasters. This judgment was an important one from the viewpoint of the current position of broadcast media. It recognized the need for regulation inter alia to prevent monopoly-like situations, thus facilitating the entry of smaller private players. The judgment was hailed by media activists who recognized the fact that it would promote community and alternative media, which would be independent of government monopoly. The judgment also took a dim view of the delay on the part of the government in formulating an appropriate policy. As stated earlier in the lecture, prior to the impact of globalization, the mass media was wholly controlled by the government, which let the media project only what the government wanted the public to see and in a way in which it wanted the public to see it. Communication was mainly in the form of national media, both public and private, in India and abroad. The broadcast media was under complete monopoly of the government of India. Private organizations were involved only in commercial advertising and sponsorships of programs. With the onset of liberalization and privatization in the 1990s and the subsequent trend of globalization, the situation underwent a humongous change. The advent of transnational media and advanced communication technologies like satellite delivery and integrated services digital network. In this environment of liberalization and globalization, the general view veered against the government control. It was argued that subjecting the media to such controls was undesirable, as it would adversely affect its independence and autonomy. To avoid that, self-regulation was considered to be the most desirable option in India. Apparently, this is a universal phenomenon seen in almost all democratic countries, starting with Sweden in 1916, Britain in 1953, and India in 1966, began to establish a self-regulatory organization called the Press Council. However, it does not have any legal powers and the government does not need to comply with its recommendations. The electronic media has to comply with the Central News Media Accreditation Guidelines of 1999, which say that if a media organization is held to have provided any false or fraudulent or forged details or documents, the representative media organization shall be debarred from accreditation up to a maximum of 5 years, but not less than 2 years, as decided by Central Press Accreditation Committee. Likewise, there is pre-publication substantiation done by editors in newspapers and media prior to the news assigning to the public domain. Apart from that, an internal mechanism for adherence to authenticity of information is sought to have ensured through mechanisms such as Media Council of Peers and media watch groups, reader's editor or internal ombudsman, letters to the editor, all of which are intended to highlight and address the wrongs done by media persons, reporters, or the management. The television media has associated its own self-regulatory mechanism, News Broadcasting Standards Authority, or NBSA. The News Broadcasters Association, or NBA, emphasized on self-regulation and unveiled its draft self-regulatory Code of Ethics in October 2008 as a replacement for the content code suggested by the government. Although regulation of media content has been initiated in the early years of liberalization, the debate gained momentum only in 2003, mainly on the issue of representation of certain minority groups in television. Following complaints from the Women's Commission and some NGOs in connection with indecent portrayal of women, violence, and surrogate advertisements on various channels, the ministry in December 2003 sent out written communication to television channels to desist from exhibiting adult content on television. The Broadcast Services Regulations Bill was finally drafted in 2006. The bill envisaged the establishment of BRAI for regulation of content while also being the administrative authority for setting up of a Public Services Broadcasting Obligation Fund or PSBOF and administering it. The PSBOF was to perform the task of looking into the public service obligations of the private broadcasters. The bill met with the opposition of journalists, as it was construed as an attack on the freedom of expression of the press. The broadcasters, too, criticized the bill for imposing excessive content regulation. The Indian news broadcasters, in an attempt to negotiate effectively with the government on the proposed bill, formed their own pressure group, the News Broadcasters Association of India or NBA. In 2008, the government issued directives to the state and district cable TV monitoring committees. A major responsibility of these committees was to ensure that no program is affecting public order, fanning widespread resentment in any community, no authorized or pirated channels are carried, and to ensure that local news is presented in an impartial manner and does not offend or incite any community. In response to the government document, the NBA on 22nd of April 2008 proposed its own draft Code of Ethics and Broadcasting Standards and a News Broadcasting Standards Authority to deal with violations and meting out punitive actions against offending broadcasters. In October 2008, the NBA brought out its draft Self-Regulatory Code of Ethics, which emphasized self-regulation as a replacement for the content code suggested by the government. The key aspects of the code addressed issues relating to sting operations, privacy, decency, and measures to be taken against an errant channel. The media coverage of terrorist attacks in Mumbai on 26th of November 2008 completely flouted the code prescribed by the NBA. In the wake of this, the ministry issued warnings and advisories to various news channels for allegedly compromising national security and the counter-offensive and offending national integrity and public sentiments. This led to renewed debate for a statutory set of regulations to be imposed on media in general and TV news in particular. The Print and Electronic Standards Regulation Bill of 2012 incorporated a provision which could have led to imposition of heavy fines and even cancellation of the license of media organizations for offences. But what drew criticism are the other provisions of the bill, which invested authorities with power to suspend or ban coverage on an event in national interest, as it was seen as a suppression of the freedom of media to report in India, something that is enshrined in the Constitution by way of guaranteeing freedom of speech. In a democracy, the freedom of press is and should be paramount. So what is the way ahead? For a meaningful self-regulatory system, it is required that such a system be prompt, proactive, participatory, and most importantly, one to which the newspaper and magazine publishing sector is committed and accountable. There is a clear need to relook at accountability systems across media, including print. It is the need of the hour to draft a common code of conduct for journalists, reporters, and editors, separately taking ideas from working journalists across print, TV, and web, retired veteran journalists, and those affiliated with media. If the government truly reposes its faith in self-regulation, it should initiate sincere efforts to mandate or facilitate the coming together of the broadcasting fraternity under one umbrella. Through consensus, the government should formalize the self-regulatory code and penalties, and bring in a provision bestowing some sort of legal recognition to the decisions of self-regulatory bodies, thereby limiting the applicability of extant laws and by prescribing some minimum standards to be followed by them. Essentially, media accountability through self-regulation can be achieved when reporters and management unite to frame norms of journalistic conduct, thereby assuring that these rules are complied with. Important regulatory institutions. Let us now look at some of the important regulatory institutions. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting is vested with the powers to frame the laws and rules and regulations pertaining to the press, broadcast media, and films. The responsibility of administering the same also lies with the MIB. Further, it performs the important function of assisting the public in general to access available information and disseminate programming content relating to entertainment, current affairs, and other similar programs, ensuring at the same time that this mix offers a judicious balance between public interest and commercial needs. It also serves as a channel for promotion of international cooperation in the areas of film and broadcast media. The Interministerial Committee constituted by it investigates any complaints in respect of violation of programming and advertising codes. MIB is also entrusted with the task of dispensing licenses, Internet Protocol television, linkage with transmission equipment, satellites, and the apparatus used for transmitting content. The Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or TRAI, is endowed with the powers to regulate telecom services and the fixing or revising of tariffs in the respect of these services. The TRAI came into existence as a result of the enactment of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India Act of 1997. TRAI is also tasked with the responsibility of formulating policies that are transparent and fair so as to encourage a clean, competitive environment for the operation of firms engaged in providing media market. From January 2004 onwards, the scope of the TRAI Act was expanded to include broadcasting and cable services, thus allowing TRAI to make recommendations in respect of A. Regulations pertaining to the maximum time permitted to pay channels for display of advertisements, and B. Terms and conditions upon which addressable systems may be provided to the customers. The Telecom Disputes Settlement and Appellate Tribunal is vested with the power to hear appeals against the orders passed by TRAI and pass orders or judgments in such cases. The Competition Commission of India, or CCI, owes its existence to the Competition Act of 2002. It has a mandate to ensure a fair and robust competitive environment for the functioning of all markets that do not operate under competitive conditions. It also strives to align the sector-specific regulatory laws with the more generic laws passed by it. Further, upon receiving a reference from a statutory agency regarding any issues pertaining to competition, it is incumbent upon CCI to give its considered opinion. It is also tasked with creating awareness in the public and imparting training about competition issues. Press Council of India, or PCI, came into existence following the Press Council Act of 1978 with the purpose of preserving the freedom of the press and maintaining as well as improving the standards of newspapers and news agencies in India. PCI's functions in brief are as follows: helping newspapers maintain their independence, building a code of conduct for journalists and news agencies, helping maintain high standards of public taste and fostering responsibility among citizens. review developments likely to restrict flow of news. Conclusion. So let us now try and summarize what we have discussed in the lecture. We understood the meaning of regulation and self-regulation and how regulation has moved to self-regulation in the Indian media scenario. We also discussed the different agencies and laws which deal with regulation and self-regulation. For more details, please read the module carefully and do attempt all the questions. For further reading suggestions, please refer to extended reading list. Thank you.